What happens when respect collides with protocol? When the weight of a uniform meets the quiet dignity of a man who's earned more honor than any medal could represent? The story I'm about to share will shake you to your core and remind you that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Picture this scene: Arlington National Cemetery on a gray October morning. The air thick with reverence and the whispered prayers of mourners gathered to honor a fallen general. But at the main gate, a confrontation was brewing that would expose the difference between following orders and understanding honor. Standing before the imposing wrought iron entrance was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s, wearing a simple black suit that had seen better days. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his hair silver white, and his hands bore the weathered marks of a life fully lived. He clutched a folded piece of paper in his trembling fingers, his pale blue eyes fixed on the ceremony preparations beyond the gate. Blocking his path were two young guards in crisp dress uniforms, their postures rigid with authority. They saw what they expected to see: an old man who had wandered too far from the public viewing area. A problem to be managed, a disruption to be cleared away before the important people arrived. The lead guard, his nameplate reading Johnson, crossed his arms and spoke with the kind of condescending patience reserved for the elderly and confused. "Sir, this is a restricted ceremony. Family and invited guests only. You'll need to return to the public area or show me your credentials." The old man said nothing. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the folded paper, extending it with a slight tremor in his hand. Johnson barely glanced at it before handing it back with a dismissive shake of his head. "This is just a generic invitation, sir. Nothing that grants you access to the secured area. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." But the old man didn't move. He stood his ground with a quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within. His silence wasn't defiance. It was something else entirely, something the young guards couldn't recognize because they'd never seen it before in their short lives. It was the stillness of a man who had faced far greater challenges than a pair of overzealous sentries. The second guard, impatient and eager to demonstrate his authority, stepped forward. "Look, Grandpa, we don't have time for this. The motorcade will be here any minute. Either you have proper documentation or you don't. And from what I can see, you don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a slap. The growing crowd of mourners began to take notice, their hushed conversations turning to curious stares. Phones emerged from pockets, capturing what appeared to be an embarrassing scene of an elderly man being turned away from a funeral. The guards, feeling the pressure of their audience, became more aggressive in their stance. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand in their youthful arrogance, was that they were standing in the presence of living history. The man before them wasn't just any old veteran seeking to pay his respects. He was a ghost from a forgotten war, a shadow from missions that officially never happened, carrying secrets that were still classified decades after the fact. The lead guard's radio crackled to life. "Base to Gate 1, what's your status? The ceremony begins in 15 minutes. Johnson keyed his radio while never taking his eyes off the old man. "Gate 1 to base, we have a minor disruption. Elderly civilian refusing to comply with restricted access protocols. We're handling it." "Copy that. Clear it up quickly. The brass is getting nervous." Johnson clipped the radio back to his belt and took a step closer to the old man. His voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "Sir, you have exactly 1 minute to walk away from this gate voluntarily, or I will have you escorted off the premises. This is not a request." The old man finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying a weight that made both guards unconsciously straighten. "I knew General Morrison. We served together. He would have wanted me here." The guards exchanged glances, their patience evaporating like morning mist. Johnson's face flushed red with frustration. "Sure you did, sir. You and every other veteran who shows up at these things claiming to be best friends with the deceased. I have heard it all before. Unless you can prove you belong here, you need to leave." Now, what happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. A black sedan with government plates pulled up to the checkpoint, its windows tinted dark. The rear door opened and out stepped a figure that made both guards snap to attention so quickly they nearly gave themselves whiplash. General Patricia Hayes, a 4-star general with silver eagles gleaming on her shoulders, emerged from the vehicle with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Her aide, a sharp-looking colonel, followed closely behind. The general's eyes immediately swept the scene, taking in the confrontation at the gate with the calculating gaze of a career military officer. But it wasn't the disruption that caught her attention. It was something else entirely. As her gaze fell upon the elderly man in the worn black suit, her expression changed. The professional mask slipped for just a moment, replaced by something that looked remarkably like recognition. And then, impossibly, what appeared to be awe. She approached slowly, her polished boots clicking against the pavement with metronomic precision. The guards, still at attention, watched in confusion as their superior officer ignored them completely and focused all her attention on the man they had been trying to remove. General Hayes stopped precisely 3 feet from the old man and did something that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. She rendered a sharp, perfect salute. Not the casual gesture of military courtesy, but the kind of salute reserved for the highest honors, the kind that spoke of profound respect. "Mr. Samuel Chen," the general said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." The guards stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. The old man they had been prepared to forcibly remove was being saluted by a 4-star general. The same man they had dismissed as confused and out of place was being treated with a level of reverence they had never seen before. Samuel Chen, the name meant nothing to them, but to those who knew the hidden histories of America's shadow wars, it was a name whispered in the same breath as legends, a name that appeared in classified files marked with the highest security clearances, a name that represented sacrifices most people could never imagine and would never know about. The general held her salute for a long moment before slowly lowering her hand. Her aide stepped forward, his own expression now one of barely controlled panic as he realized the magnitude of what had almost happened. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after the ceremony had ended. Johnson, his face now pale as paper, opened his mouth to speak but found no words. His partner stood equally stunned, both men beginning to understand that they had made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. They had looked at a hero and seen only an obstacle. They had mistaken quiet dignity for confusion and earned respect for entitlement. The general's voice, when she spoke again, was measured and controlled, but it carried an undercurrent of steel that made both guards flinch. "Gentlemen," she said, her gaze finally shifting to the trembling guards, "do you have any idea who you just attempted to remove from these premises?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Johnson's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his earlier confidence evaporating like smoke in the wind. His partner managed to stammer out a weak response. "Ma'am, we were just following protocol." He had no proper identification, no security clearance. General Hayes took a step closer to them, her presence now radiating the kind of authority that could make seasoned soldiers question their life choices. "Protocol," she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Let me educate you about protocol, soldiers. This man standing before you is Samuel Chen. Perhaps that name doesn't ring a bell in your young minds, but it should be etched in the foundation of every military installation in this country. She turned slightly, addressing not just the guards, but the growing crowd of onlookers who had abandoned all pretense of discretion and were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. During the Vietnam War, when most of your parents were still children, Sergeant Chen led a classified reconnaissance unit deep behind enemy lines. For 18 months, he and his team operated in conditions that would break most men before their first week was up. The general's voice grew stronger, more commanding, as she continued the tale that few people were cleared to hear. They called themselves the Gray Ghosts, and they were tasked with missions that officially never happened. Gathering intelligence that saved thousands of American lives, disrupting supply lines that shortened the war by months, operating with such precision and courage that enemy forces began to believe they were fighting supernatural beings. Samuel Chen remained silent throughout this revelation, his weathered face showing neither pride nor embarrassment at having his secrets exposed. He simply stood with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation, as if being honored by a 4-star general was as natural as breathing. But General Hayes wasn't finished. She fixed her steely gaze back on the guards, who now looked like they wished the earth would swallow them whole. On March 15, 1971, Sergeant Chen's unit was compromised during an extraction. Enemy forces surrounded their position with overwhelming numbers. His teammates were wounded, unable to move. The extraction helicopter was taking heavy fire and couldn't land. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the ceremony preparations seemed to have paused as word spread through the gathering about what was happening at the main gate. This was history unfolding in real time, secrets being revealed that had been buried for decades. "Do you know what Sergeant Chen did?" the general asked, though it was clear she didn't expect an answer from the speechless guards. He ordered the helicopter to leave. Then he picked up his wounded teammates one by one and carried them through 2 miles of hostile jungle to an alternate extraction point, under enemy fire, with a shattered leg and a bullet in his shoulder. He saved 6 lives that day, and the only recognition he ever received was a classified commendation that he wasn't even allowed to tell his own family about. The weight of her words settled over the scene like a heavy blanket. The guards stood rigid, no longer with authority, but with the paralyzing realization of their colossal mistake. They had treated a genuine American hero like an unwanted vagrant, dismissing his service and his sacrifice with the casual cruelty of ignorance. Johnson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "General, we had no way of knowing. His identification didn't show any of this information." General Hayes's expression could have frozen fire. "That's exactly the point, soldier. Mr. Chen's service record is so classified that it doesn't appear on any standard identification. The missions he completed, the lives he saved, the sacrifices he made, they exist only in the deepest vaults of military intelligence. But that doesn't make them any less real or any less worthy of respect." She gestured toward the cemetery grounds beyond the gate, where flags flew at half-mast and honor guards stood at attention. Every single person attending this ceremony today owes their freedom to men like Mr. Chen, men who fought in shadows so that others could stand in the light, men who never asked for recognition, never demanded parades, never sought the spotlight. The general's aide stepped forward and whispered something in her ear. She nodded curtly and checked her watch. The ceremony was supposed to begin in mere minutes, but this lesson was far from over. The crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people, all drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing something extraordinary. Samuel Chen finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained him through decades of silence. "General Hayes, with all due respect, These young men were doing their jobs. They couldn't have known about classified operations from before they were born. Perhaps we should let this matter rest. But the general shook her head firmly. No, Mr. Chen. With respect, this is exactly why incidents like this happen. These soldiers and countless others like them have been taught to follow rules without understanding their purpose. They've been trained to see uniforms and credentials instead of character and sacrifice. She turned back to address the crowd, her voice rising to carry across the gathering. This is Samuel Chen, and this is what a real hero looks like. Not the Hollywood version with perfect uniforms and gleaming medals. Not the recruiting poster image with a square jaw and steely eyes. This is a man who answered his country's call when it needed him most, who served with distinction in operations you'll never read about in history books, and who has lived with the weight of classified secrets for over 50 years. The general paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her final point. And when he came here today to pay his respects to a fallen comrade, to honor a brother in arms who understood the true cost of freedom, he was treated like an unwelcome intruder by soldiers who should have recognized the very values he embodied. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was showing respect for the moment. Samuel Chen stood unchanged, his weathered hands still clutched around that simple folded invitation, his eyes now focused somewhere beyond the immediate scene, perhaps seeing faces and places that existed only in memory. Johnson and his partner remained at attention, but their rigid postures now spoke of shame rather than authority. They had learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their careers, a lesson about looking beyond the surface and understanding that true honor doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. The general stepped forward, her polished boots clicking against the pavement with deliberate precision. She gestured toward the cemetery grounds where the assembled mourners waited in hushed anticipation. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying both invitation and command, "would you honor us by joining the ceremony? Your place is not in the public viewing area. Your place is with the family, with those who knew General Morrison's true character." Samuel Chen nodded slowly, his weathered face showing the faintest trace of gratitude. He had not come seeking recognition or special treatment. He had simply wanted to say goodbye to an old friend, a brother forged in the crucible of classified missions and shared danger. But as he began to walk toward the gate, something unexpected happened. The crowd began to applaud. It started with a single person, an elderly woman whose husband had served in Korea, and spread like wildfire through the gathering. The applause grew louder, more sustained, until it became a thunderous ovation that echoed across the hallowed grounds of Arlington. Phone cameras that had been recording what they thought was an embarrassing confrontation now captured something entirely different. They captured the moment when hidden history stepped into the light. General Hayes walked beside Samuel as they passed through the gate, her presence ensuring that no one would question his right to be there. But the lesson was far from over. She stopped and turned back to face the two guards, who remained frozen in their positions like statues carved from shame and regret. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the applause, "this is what I want you to remember. The next time you encounter someone whose credentials don't fit neatly into your forms and databases, ask yourself this question. What if this person has earned the right to be here through sacrifices I cannot imagine? What if their service was so vital, so sensitive, that it was deliberately erased from public record?" Johnson finally found the courage to speak, though his voice cracked with emotion. "General, how do we know? How do we tell the difference between someone like Mr. Chen and someone who doesn't belong?" It was Samuel who answered, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent in the shadows. "Son, you look with your heart, not just your eyes. You listen to the silence between words. You recognize that some of the most important stories are the ones never told, and some of the greatest heroes are the ones who never sought recognition. The general nodded approvingly. Mr. Chen is exactly right. Real security isn't about keeping everyone out. It's about knowing who belongs, even when they don't carry the right paperwork. It's about understanding that some credentials are written in scars and memories, rather than on official documents. Samuel Chen's story reminds us that true heroes walk among us every day, their valor hidden beneath ordinary appearances. The next time you encounter someone whose story doesn't fit your expectations, remember this moment at Arlington. Honor isn't always announced with fanfare. Sometimes it whispers through weathered hands and patient eyes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to understand that respect must be earned through recognition, not demanded through protocol.